Oh, hi, I'm Megan Harris from Blue Mountains Grammar School. I was the senior marker on questions 19, 21, 26, 34 and 36 of the Standard 2 paper this year. So we started with question 19. All the questions that we had were fairly lengthy as far as what the kids had to read, which made things rather difficult. One of the things I would encourage the kids to do, and I'm sure you all do anyway, is please make sure that the kids are actually highlighting information as they go through these long-winded questions so that it's easier for them to refer back to what's actually needed out of the question. I'm actually going to skip over to part A. So unfortunately we can't fit the whole question on the page because it's so big. Okay, so with this question, in part A, they were told that if the area of the paddock was 30,000 metres squared, what was the value of X? So obviously the quickest way to do this question would have been just to take your ruler and go across at 30,000 square metres to read off your values. Now, unfortunately, a lot of the students did not actually read the total question, which actually asked for the largest possible value. So we had a lot of answers of 100, which took them out straight away for a mark. Okay, so in B, find the values of X so that the area of the paddock is as large as possible. So going back to our diagram, some students tried to actually read values off for the area on the graph, rather than just finding, first of all, the maximum point for X, which gave us 150 metres. So if we then took our 150 metres, the next problem was, going back here, we were given two equations and some of the students didn't know which equation to actually substitute that value into. So what we were asked was find the values of X and Y. So obviously they needed the equation that had X and Y in it. Substitution, those people that managed to get the 150, a lot of them managed to actually solve the equation. There were issues with solving though, and it's something that people need to be looking at carefully, especially for these basic equations. If the students were able to get the X equals 150, then straight away they've managed to get themselves a mark. If they used a different value, but they were able to then substitute their different value to solve for their Y, as long as neither of their values were 0, then if they solved that correctly, they were actually able to pick up a mark there as well. So encourage your students, if they're not sure if their answer's right, for example, X equals 150, keep going through the question, because progressing through a question means you may be able to pick up another mark later on. So we then had to use your values from part B. All right, some people wanted to make up new values, but those people who used their values, whether those values were correct or not, are still going to get their full mark. So if they use their incorrect values correctly, they're going to get a mark. However, if the values obviously multiply to 0, then they cannot get a mark, because logically we cannot have an area of 0. So important, reinforcing with kids that their answer has to make sense, because some of the answers that we received were enormous and obviously didn't make sense. Okay, question 21 related to the inflation rate of a jumper. Now, the issue that we found here was, because the inflation rate was so low, there were actually a number of ways of doing this question, both correctly and incorrectly, to get a very similar answer. So once again, with any of these questions, please don't round as you go. Please make sure you carry your decimal points so that you end up with a decimal point answer, in this case 119.61, where we have something a little bit different. So it was only 1 cent different to doing the question incorrectly. So again, you know, kids are still doing that rounding to 5 cents and rounding to 10 cents. We don't want any rounding. Just keep it at 1 to the nearest cent. Okay, this was a question where if the students were good at GST or unitary method, like understanding that concept, they were able to actually solve this question. A lot of kids got a little bit confused along the way between what was future value and what was present value. So they were putting their values around the wrong way in their equation. But those who were actually able to substitute correctly into the future value equation were generally able to solve that equation. So that was very good. Okay, I was very disappointed actually with the network question and the results that we saw this year. I marked the network question last year and I felt that teachers had put in a lot of extra time to make sure kids understood networks. This year we seem to have kids with a lot less understanding than we saw before. In our first question, we were asked to find the minimum time needed to prepare the meal. Now, the better students were able to forward scan on their diagram and actually get to a point where they achieved that minimum value that they needed. Other students got lost on the diagram. One error was people going against the arrows. A lot of the things that we seem to see this year were things that sort of showed that the kids didn't have a very good understanding of how to use a network diagram. Those students that at the start of this question actually used their diagram to forward and backward scan seemed to progress through the paper a lot better than those that hadn't used the diagram well. I've given you with the solution there, the diagram that could have been used with a couple of different options on the values. Now, list the activities which make up the critical path for this network. A lot of people were giving us a variety of answers here. They did not know that the critical path is not necessarily the shortest path. So we had a lot of kids giving us the shortest path rather than looking at their forward and backward scanning to work out the critical path in their diagram. And that was just a matter of giving us the letters. Please ensure you're working from left to right on the diagram and that your letters are obviously in order. Part C was probably the part that had the most issues. If the students were able to get at least 2 of the answers for this, they would get 1 mark. I'm just going to go back to our diagram here down the bottom. Now, the float time we were asked for, earlier start time and float time for A. Now, for those, as I said, that had the diagram, they were able to go back to their diagram and see that the float time was actually 0. And, sorry, the early start time was 0 and the float time was 12 because they were able to do just their subtraction there. Okay, so the majority of kids that actually progressed to this step were actually able to get the answers for A. Those who did not write on their diagram actually could not really progress to the next step because they just managed to get themselves a little bit confused. So here we had our critical path, which was 44 and 20. But the time taken to do this G path was 9. So some kids were giving us 24 because they weren't actually then considering the time for the activity, which was 9. So they then had to subtract that to end up with their 15 float time. All right. Another thing I found, a lot of kids were writing, obviously they're writing with pen because it's a HSC exam, but perhaps when you're writing on a network diagram in an exam, do it in pencil because if it's not part of the solution, then you can rub that out and keep using it to correct your work rather than just scribbling and trying to change numbers on the actual diagram, which ended up a bit confusing. Those students who managed in part B to highlight on their diagram, that actually helped them to better transfer their answer onto their answer paper. Okay, we then have questions 34 and 36. Now 34 and 36 were the common questions across Standard 2 and Mathematics. So we worked with the mathematics markers so that we had a scheme that was the same across both courses so that we knew that the actual students were being marked consistently. So that was good. Now, we had a few issues in 34 with students understanding what they're actually being asked. Now, obviously, we encouraged students to read the whole question. Things like recurrence relation, I think, confuse some students, but sometimes they need to just look at the key parts of a question and see if they can use the numerical values given to actually get some form of answer, because they sort of were stepped into this. They were told that A0 equals 60,000. And if they looked at that equation, that first part of the equation is just our compound interest formula. So if they tried to relate it back to something familiar that they'd seen before, it would have helped. Obviously, the subscript is where we had issues. Some students were actually trying to multiply the subscript into the compound interest equation. It's very important that you do go through this with your students, because unfortunately, some kids that were doing better earlier on actually were having issues here. Okay, so given our A0 value or initial value, students were able to substitute into the equation, those better students, and then progress through. Some students were obviously doing a lot of this work on their calculator. Please encourage your students. If the question is worth at least 2 marks, then we need to be seeing at least a couple of lines of working. Again, when we were talking about rounding before, please do not round till you get to the end. We were lucky here, our A2 value was actually to 1 decimal place, and then we could round our A3 value. And again, start the question, get into as much as you can. If you've done the first step, you're generally going to pick up 1 mark. Those kids who understood what an annuity was by looking at this and seeing that money was taken out each year or each month, they were better able to understand the question. Okay, in the next part of the question, we had a lot of confusion. The majority of students were able to understand that they had actually taken out $2,400 over the period of time. So that actually gave them a mark, which was good. They then needed to think about what they started with and what they ended with, which was $1,507.51, and then take off the money that they had actually withdrawn themselves so that they could work out what the interest was. Now, again, things like issues with not being able to use that original equation correctly did stop a lot of kids from getting into this section. But again, please encourage your students. If they can manage to get any form of answer in part A, try and use the answer in part B and show us the working so that we can give them something along the way. So this 3 times 800 equals 2,400 was a good 1 mark out of a 2-mark question. So encourage that, please. Also, make sure that they're careful when they transcribe numbers, because we have issues with zeros. That came up a lot. And they need to comprehend what is happening when you're taking money out and how to calculate the interest. Okay, the famous cricket question. Now, I've just put a couple of notes on the right-hand side here. Because this question was so long, it was very important that, one, the students highlight as they go, But secondly, I also encourage the students as they're progressing through to write notes on a question that is this long, because those notes may actually be looked at and may actually be a reward for the students where they may gain a mark, because this was a 5-mark question. Okay, so we started with stepping our way through the information that was given. Okay, so we're talking about 20 days. We progress down. The next thing we come to is the box and whisker plot, which gave us 22. So I would have written median equals 22 above this. We still had students that were getting confused between mean and median. All right, please ensure that the students know that we're only using median box and whisker plots in this course. So if they were confused with mean here, then that actually messed them up in the next part of the question. Okay, so here we had our median of 22, which we've written here. We've then said the mean temperature is 0.525 below the median. So we had students that wanted to add that on. So anywhere where the students had actually taken their median and taken off the 0.525 and ended up with a solution, again, they could have been rewarded. All right, so that was our X mean, which was 21.475. The next step was about the chirps and the 20 recordings. So 684 divided by 20 would be here to give our next mean. The scientist fits a least squares regression line using the data XY, where X is the temperature in degrees Celsius and Y is the number of chirps. So we're going to use the equation. Again, students putting their X's and Y's back to front, and some students actually putting their X value in with the B. Please be careful. As you calculate something, write down the pronumeral that it relates to. Now, here we had, they told us that the average of the X and the average of the Y, or mean of the X, mean of the Y, were points on this equation. Now, students who actually labelled their values that they'd calculated up here correctly and substituted were able to progress to get B. Unfortunately, a number of students had an issue with this -10 and they were subtracting it from the other side. Again, that comes back to learning how to do basic equations. Okay, so if a student was able to actually substitute their X and Y or the correct X and Y to solve for B, they're 3 to 4 marks already into the question. Now, the last thing they gave us in the question, so here's our, we've calculated our mean for X, our mean for Y, we've substituted, we've calculated our B. Now, remember we said before, let's restrict the rounding. So we like to see the 3 dots, which means that the students are carrying the answer that they have on their calculator, so they haven't done any rounding. Once they then calculated that and substituted the 19, we ended up with 29 chirps. Now, a couple of points here. Those students who showed some working and managed to get to 29 chirps were rewarded better than those that had no working and ended up with 29 chirps. It was very rare. I think we saw it 1 or 2 times. The most common issue that we had was students were getting their X's and Y's and thinking that if they put their Y's over their X's, then that actually gave them the gradient of the line. Now, that was not rewarded because the gradient of the line was obviously affected by this -10.6063. So the students must question as they go through the information that's supplied, whether they have used all the information. All right, so if you have not used this equation to sort out your B, then perhaps you have done that calculation incorrectly. So please make sure you use all the information supplied in the question and that you carry all your decimal points so that the answer that you end up with is actually the correct solution. All right, now, as far as 29 chirps was concerned, the last thing between mathematics and the standard course is we rewarded students who actually showed they're working and may have had an incorrect calculation at the end. If they managed to get to the final step with all their solution correct and substitutions correct, then they still would get full marks. But obviously that changes from year to year, so students are encouraged to go all the way through the question and find their final answer. And that's to the end of our questions.